I'm Rhonda Buss and welcome to the Sew News Decades of Style Sew Along. We're working on the Arches skirt. Now, as I explained before, this is a skirt design it's based on a vintage skirt. When vintage skirts were made, they weren't vintage at the time, but a lot more work was put into constructing the skirt. So I thought with this sew along that we would take the time to add some of the extra techniques to make our skirt just a little extra special. And one of those is underlining. Now, if you've never done underlining before, please don't be intimidated. Once you do it, it's one of those things that once you start underlining a garment, you want all your garments to look as pretty as this one, because the finished product is just so lovely. So to underline it, what do you use to underline your fabric? There are a number of different things and a number of different fabrics that you can use to underline. My favorite is a good cotton batiste. And you want to get a very good quality cotton batiste, something that's lightweight, but you know, don't just go down to your local little neighborhood fabric store and get a cheap cotton batiste, because it's not going to act as well with your fabric as a good quality cotton batiste will. You can also use a silk organza, but for something like this project, I really prefer a cotton batiste. Another thing that you need to think about with your underlining is what you need to wash the fabric and dry it so you pre-shrink it. That's imperative, because if you don't, the fabric is going to shrink as time goes on, and then you could actually end up with puckers in your garment, which you don't want. So get a good cotton batiste, bring it home, wash it, dry it, press it out, and then lay it out and cut out your pattern pieces just as you would your fashion fabric. So once you've done that, or before we start talking about putting the underlining in our garment, let's talk a little bit about the pattern. The pattern, as we talked about before, one of the most intimidating factors of this skirt is the point that's here in the front. And as I said, you know, if you've done any amount of sewing and you've encountered a point, you know that that is just a very frustrating thing, that you end up with a little pucker, or you know, it can be maddening. But with this skirt, it's really fail-proof, believe it or not. The most important thing, as you look at the pattern, there are 3 pattern pieces for the front of the skirt, just one for the back. But for the front of the skirt, you'll see that the center front, there is a line for the center front. It's very important that you clip that so you know exactly where the center front is. You'll also see little X's on this little bow. You'll also see little circles and this designates where the pleat is going to be. It's very important that you mark these areas in order to line your skirt up correctly. And then you'll see here's the center front. The center front is actually cut on the fold. Oh, one other thing about the skirt before I go any further is if you look at the cover of the pattern, you'll see that the skirt is really fairly long. I cut 6 inches off the bottom of my skirt because I just wanted it to be right around my knees. I didn't want it to be such a long skirt and have that real true vintage style. I wanted it to have a little bit more of a modern look to it. So I did cut 6 inches off the bottom, and then I hemmed it up 2 inches on top of that. So in essence, it's 8 inches off the bottom of the skirt. But so anyway, so the center front is cut on the fold, and the center front would match up. So you can see here that the X's will match together, and then that goes together like that. Of course, the center front would then have another side because it's been cut on the fold. Then we have a side front piece. And we also have the dot. We have a little bow here. And so you would also, in matching this up, this gets matched up like this. All right, so at this point, it seems maybe still a little bit intimidating, but I can assure you it's not. Just make sure that you mark all of your dots. Let's talk briefly about the underlining. When you're underlining your skirt, you'll cut the pattern pieces just as you did your fashion fabric, as I said. Before you begin any construction on your skirt, you want to baste the underlining to the fashion fabric. And what I do is I just do a hand basting stitch. I prefer not to do the basting on the machine. Just the machine can pull the fabric one way or another, and we really want to keep it as steady and in place as possible. One other thing that I like to do before I start my hand basting is I take my batiste and I lay it on top of my fashion fabric. I iron the two together. Now there's no stick or fusible to the batiste, but just that little bit of an ironing process actually helps the two pieces of fabric begin to work as one. So you would pin it together and then just do a hand basting stitch, and you want to start at one end, finish at the other end, and cut your thread when you get to the end. So cut your thread. You don't want to turn the corner and go the other way, because if you turn the corner and go the other way, you can actually pull this just a little bit, and we want to keep everything as flat and nice as possible. So you can see here I have not stitched across the top. On this side of my back skirt, I did stitch across the top. I also I did a basting stitch for where my back dart is. And here you can see a little bits of red thread. This is actually a tailor's tack. Tailor tacks are really a nice thing to do. Of course, you can always use your tracing paper and a tracing wheel to mark your darts in, and you would just do that, and then you want to do the basting stitch. And the reason that you want to baste in your dart is before you sew the dart together is that you want the fashion fabric and the batiste to be held together as one, so that when you sew this, there won't be any shifting of the fabric. So tailor's tacks, I really like tailor tacks. When I sew a dart like this, and one of the reasons that when it's a better garment that I'm doing, one of the reasons that I shy away a little from using a tracing wheel and tracing paper, two reasons. One reason is that depending upon the tracing paper that you're using, it can bleed through a little. The other thing is just think about the aspect of a tracing wheel. It has little serrated teeth on it. So as you push it through your fabric, you can actually get little pinholes in your fabric that you don't want. So if you just do a tailor's tack, you have one mark and you're done. You pull the threads out when you're finished. Now with my dart, so to mark my dart, you can see I have only one tailor tack. Here's the dart in the fabric, or in the pattern. So it's marked here. So I marked the very tip, and what I did is I did two small clips right at the top so that I knew where the top should go together. I did not mark that with a tailor tack, only the bottom. So in sewing a tailor tack, that's quite easy. Like I said, they're quite easy to do, and I'll just do a little sample here for you. So I marked this, for the sample, I marked this in ink, not that you want to do that on your garment, by no means, but for the sample I wanted to make sure that you could see where the dot is. So you just take your thread, no knots, do not put any knots in your thread, and you go in one side, out the other, pull it through, and we don't want to pull this tight against the fabric. What we want to do now is we want to clip this and we want to clip that. So on one side you have your little eyelashes, your threads that are sticking up, and on the other side you can see that there's a perfect little X on the other side. So you know where your mark is on either side of your fabric, and you take no chance of having anything bleed through or a mark in your fabric that you don't want to have, or possible little holes in your garment from the tracing wheel. So give it a try. I think you'll really enjoy doing tailor tacks. It's something that I enjoy doing quite a bit. So with the front of our, back to the front of our garment, in putting it together, we'll look at it from the back side. And most of this is actually just one piece laid on top of another. On this side, I can show you, my thread matches, so it's a little bit difficult to see, but you can actually see that this is not sewn in the seam. This is just top stitched on top. So here on the skirt, I did 2 rows of top stitching. One is just an edge stitch, and then I came in a 1/4 inch, a little bit more, maybe about 3/8 of an inch, and did a second row of top stitching just to be decorative. But that is what's holding it together. So you never actually sew into this point. You just lay pattern pieces on top of each other, and that's why this point is foolproof. So here we go. Now one thing is you can see in the center front, you see this little overlap here, and here it is in the pattern here. Now I'm going to cut that off because this does not need to stay there, and we'll just cut it off so that it's even with our seam allowance underneath, and that got rid of that. So you can see the point is perfect. It lays nice and straight. And I'll show you with this piece. Now, one other thing to think about is, of course, I did the basting stitches by hand to hold the batiste to my to my fashion fabric. But we also want to know exactly where we fold this seam allowance in. I did do this on the machine, and that's just fine. And you can see my white thread there. So the seam allowances on the skirt are 5/8 of an inch. So I did a basting stitch at 5/8 of an inch. The fact that I did it in white makes it easy for me to be able to pull it out once I've top stitched the 2 together. So I pressed it back, clipped my seam, and now I simply lay this on top and then pin it in place. Before you stitch this down, simply sew the pleat together, just one long straight seam, that's it. So now we have this pinned together, and from the front side, we'd want to move our pins to the front because we don't want our pins in the back. And then from the front side, just as I did here, where it's top stitched, we will top stitch right along this edge, and then this panel will be secure to the rest of the panels just as you see here. So I think you'll find the construction of the skirt to be quite easy. it all goes together quite well. In our next segment, we'll be talking about the waistband and a couple of special techniques to think about when you construct the waistband for the skirt. Until then, thank you so much for joining me.